We live in a modern globalized prison, 2016, but the way in which we understand the world around us, that worldview, whether we like it or not, is a worldview that has been shaped by a very complicated process, and that, in the context of Southeast Asia, includes our colonial history. Just because the imperial flags are not flying anymore, it doesn't mean that empire is over. Empire remains, but it remains in different forms. It remains in the form of the language that we use, the themes, the motifs, the symbols that we are familiar with. It's all around us. The challenge for us was to not only go to the places where these events took place, but to look for residual elements, traces of these events and people who remembered them. And we managed to find people whose lives today are still shaped by events that took place a century ago. And that really supports the arguments that we are still living in the long shadow of the 19th century. The court of Yogyakarta is one example. The status of the royal families in Indonesia in the year 2016 were determined by events that took place 200 years ago as a result of the British invasion of Java. It's one of the quirks of Indonesia's post-colonial development that, because the struggle against the Dutch was so intense and so violent, the episode of the British occupation of Java has been largely forgotten. But what was left behind in the wake of the British withdrawal was this notion of the Javanese and Indonesians by extension as a people who are trapped by their own past, trapped in their own history. And as a result of that, reduced to sort of cliched stereotypes. Now that continues, because it's part and parcel of how 19th century colonialism worked, how you classified communities and nations according to a hierarchy, which placed some communities higher than others. And we see that reproduced today in the way in which, even as Indonesians imagine themselves or Southeast Asians imagine themselves, we fall back on stereotypes. So our national dress, whatever nation we may belong to, is often a mode of dress that was rendered typical in the 19th century in the way in which colonialists looked at us. Prior to that, it could be argued that Southeast Asians simply wore whatever was in their cupboard, and there was no sense of this piece of cloth is my identity, or this dress is my identity, this food is my identity. Pre-modern Southeast Asians were not burdened by this politics of identity. They simply behaved the way they did according to the circumstances around them. So I think there's always this historical loop that we're trapped in, and we can't really get out of it. When we were in Borneo, for instance, and we looked at how the manner in which some communities in that part of Southeast Asia continue to perpetuate the myth of the headhunter. That's hugely ironic, because these tropes, these stereotypes, these images, they go back to a time where that exotic image was also the justification for invasion and colonization and war. Indochina, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, we saw the long result of a process of attempting to civilize Southeast Asia on terms that were not defined by Southeast Asians. So the French introduced the notion of the modern state, a centralized bureaucracy, but also an ideological state. And part of that process of colonial acculturation was also the introduction of ideas that are really alien to this part of the world, including the notion that society could begin again from nothing, inspired by the French Revolution. Well, 100 years later, we saw an attempt to reconstruct Cambodia again from year zero, and that was the Khmer Rouge. So we never unchain ourselves from the past, and it accompanies us in our vocabulary and the way we look at the world. And that's why it's interesting to see and then to meet these people, because in the way that they explain themselves to themselves and to others today, they reactivate these memories that have been forgotten. The series is basically centered around books, about how these books attempted to codify, explain, understand, and present to the world a Southeast Asia that was really being invented along the way. We're talking about books written by men who had an agenda, which was to go out, chart, navigate, know the world, acquire bits of that world, colonize these lands, alter their economies for the sake of colonial capitalism. And they belonged to the most powerful militarized commercial entity the world has ever seen. There has never been anything like the British East India Company until today. We cannot think of an equivalent. There is no conglomerate on the planet today that has a private army and a private navy. There is no company on the planet today that has power to seize foreign lands, colonize foreign lands in the name of their country. This tendency we have to somehow, romanticize the past and to valorize people who are basically empire builders is sadly a feature that we see across many parts of the non-Western world until today. And I find that somewhat difficult to stomach. As a result of this historical distance, we no longer live in the 19th century. And because our present reality is so horrible to contemplate at times. If you look at the state of the world today, wars, religious conflict, and what have you, we tend to view the past through these rose-tinted glasses, and somehow cling on to this idea that yes, this was a colonial era, but it was somehow a bit more benign. Now I think this is absolutely bunkum, of course. This is nonsense. Empires never grow in a benign way. Empires are built with bayonets and cannons and howitzers and rockets. Empires are built through force and violence. Now if we go back and somehow try to sanitize that in order to have these neat dichotomies between good old Raja Brooke, who was not such a bad guy after all, and these exotic headhunters who today get conjured up again and again in theme parks and popular fiction or what have you, then I think we are in danger of not only erasing the past but also forgiving the past.